The hall was so quiet you could almost hear the heartbeat of the crowd. Every seat was filled. Every breath felt heavy. The Grand Conference Hall at the University of Chicago Law School had seen many lectures, but never a moment quite like this. People had come expecting a debate about law and politics. What they did not know was that they were about to witness a clash that would live on in American legal history. At the front of the room sat Judge Richard Posner. His silver hair caught the light. His back was perfectly straight. For more than 30 years, this man had been one of the sharpest minds on the federal bench. Professors quoted him. Lawyers feared him. Students dreamed of clerking for him. To many, he was the voice of reason and authority. But that afternoon, even his steady hands trembled slightly as he looked across the stage at the woman standing behind the microphone. Her name was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Dressed in a simple dark suit, she held a thick folder of papers against her chest. Her eyes were calm but bright, the kind of eyes that carried both pain and purpose. Moments earlier, Posner had dismissed her in front of everyone, calling her a politician pretending to be a lawyer. The words still hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. Some people in the audience had nodded along with him. Others had winced, sensing that he had gone too far. But now, as Crockett stood tall, the energy in the room began to shift. You could feel it, that quiet moment before a storm. She took a slow breath. "Judge Posner," she said softly, her voice steady but firm, "you questioned my legal credentials. You suggested that I am just a politician who claims to understand the law." Her tone was not angry. It was deliberate, careful, measured, the kind of calm that comes only from someone who knows exactly what they are about to do. People leaned forward. Some held up their phones to record. Others simply froze, afraid to miss a single word. "Well," she continued, "allow me to share something that might change your mind." The crowd stirred. Reporters adjusted their recorders. Professors straightened in their seats. Law students whispered to one another, sensing they were witnessing history. This was no longer a routine conference. It had turned into a test of pride, intellect, and truth. For those watching later, imagine the air that day, heavy with expectation, charged with electricity. You could almost hear the tension buzzing like a faint hum. On one side, the legendary judge, whose opinions had shaped decades of legal thought. On the other, a congresswoman once doubted, now standing ready to defend not only herself but an entire generation of lawyers who refused to fit the old mold. Before we continue deeper into this showdown, remember to hit that like button and subscribe, because what happens next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about power, respect, and redemption in the world of law. Judge Posner adjusted his glasses. His expression was unreadable. He had spent a lifetime dissecting arguments, cutting through weak reasoning like a scalpel through silk. He was not used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already written off as a lightweight. But something in Crockett's calm presence unsettled him. She was too composed, too confident. She was not there to argue feelings, she was there to prove something. Who was Jasmine Crockett? To many in that hall, she was just another politician with a law degree. But those who truly knew her story understood that she was forged in the fires of real struggle. Born and raised in Dallas, she had fought her way through law school, often working 2 jobs to pay tuition. She had started her career defending those no one else would touch, the poor, the voiceless, the forgotten. When she walked into a courtroom, she brought with her the weight of every person she had ever represented. Judge Posner, by contrast, had lived a life of privilege and intellect. After Harvard and decades on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, his words could change markets, laws, even history. He had built his empire on logic and precision. But with all his achievements came a flaw that only his closest peers dared to mention: his pride. He believed that political lawyers had diluted the purity of legal reasoning. To him, true law existed only in the courtroom, not in the halls of Congress. That belief had brought them here, 2 worlds colliding. The quiet tension in the hall thickened as Crockett lifted her chin and met the judge's eyes. For a brief moment neither of them spoke. The audience could feel the weight of unspoken history pressing down on the stage, the old guard of American law facing a new voice demanding to be heard. Crockett placed her folder on the podium and opened it with slow, deliberate care. The sound of paper sliding across the wood seemed louder than it should have been. Every ear in the room caught it. She looked up and said softly, "Judge Posner, you say I've abandoned the practice of law. Let's talk about that." Her words fell like drops of water in still air. The judge's eyebrows tightened, a faint crease appeared on his forehead. He was curious now, maybe even wary. Crockett drew the first document from her folder. The white pages looked almost radiant under the stage light. 3 months ago, she said, I stood before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. The case was Henderson versus Texas Department of Education. It dealt with the Equal Protection Clause and public school funding. The brief I wrote is right here. She raised the pages slightly so the first row could see the binding. I cited 47 federal cases, developed new arguments on how the 14th Amendment interacts with state policy, and the panel accepted our reasoning unanimously. The hall stirred. You could hear the faint rustle of suits and notebooks. Even the judge leaned forward, elbows on the table. The woman he had called a fake lawyer was reciting federal court victories from memory. She continued, her tone level and patient, as if teaching a seminar. 6 months ago I represented a coalition of voting rights advocates in Martinez versus Dallas County. We challenged election procedures that disproportionately hurt minority communities. I drafted the motion for preliminary injunction myself, and the federal judge granted it, praising its clarity and precision. A whisper passed through the audience. Students looked at one another, wide-eyed. The professors who had once studied under Posner exchanged uneasy glances. Everyone realized that what she held in her hands was not political theater. It was evidence. Real, detailed, documented evidence of a lawyer who still lived and breathed the craft. Crockett's voice never rose. It didn't need to. Confidence replaces volume when truth stands on its own. Judge Posner removed his glasses and wiped them with a small handkerchief, a habit that always signaled deep thought. When he put them back on, he did not interrupt. He simply watched. Crockett reached for another file. Last year, she said, I handled a pro bono immigration case, Ramirez versus Department of Homeland Security. It involved constitutional due process and international treaty rights for families. The brief was 89 pages long. The court called it exemplary legal scholarship. She paused, letting the statement breathe. That case wasn't about politics, Judge Posner. It was about people. Real people who needed someone to fight for them when no one else would. Something inside the audience shifted, a quiet emotional current replacing the earlier tension. Many of those older lawyers in the crowd had started their careers believing the same thing, that the law existed to protect the powerless. Somewhere along the way, many had forgotten. Crockett was reminding them. The judge finally spoke, his tone more measured now. You keep quite a docket for someone serving in Congress, he said. The crowd chuckled softly. It wasn't an insult this time, it was half admiration, half bewilderment. I don't sleep much, Crockett replied gently, and the room laughed again. But then her eyes grew serious. You accused me of abandoning the courts. The truth is, Judge, I never left them. I just refused to stop serving justice when I stepped into politics. For the first time that day, Posner said nothing. His hands were folded, his gaze steady but less severe. Crockett opened another section of her folder. The colored tabs glowed like little flags of patience and proof. These, she said, are federal filings from the last 2 years. Motions, appeals, injunctions, all argued in courts across Texas, Louisiana, and Illinois. All handled pro bono. I take no fees. I use my congressional salary to represent clients who can't afford proper counsel. The words landed hard. People who had doubted her motives now saw her differently. A few in the audience nodded slowly. You could almost feel the wave of respect rising. Judge Posner leaned back, eyes fixed on her. He wasn't defeated, he was learning. You could see it in the slight movement of his jaw, the way he breathed through his nose like a man adjusting to a new reality. The audience waited for him to reply, but he didn't. Instead, he let her continue. Crockett took out one last file, thicker, heavier, sealed with a blue ribbon. "And this," she said, "was filed 3 weeks ago with the United States Supreme Court." She placed it carefully on the podium, her hand resting on its cover. Thompson versus Federal Bureau of Prisons. It raises a constitutional question under the 8th Amendment regarding federal prison conditions. She looked directly at him. "Judge, you know how rare it is for the court to even accept a petition for certiorari. This one was accepted on first submission, no corrections requested, no procedural faults found." The hall erupted in murmurs. Filing before the Supreme Court is the Mount Everest of legal work. Even veteran attorneys struggle with its demands. Yet here was a sitting congresswoman who had not only filed a petition but had it accepted flawlessly. Judge Posner's eyes softened. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "You wrote that yourself?" "Every word," Crockett replied. "And I made sure it honored both the law and the people it protects." He nodded slowly, and for a moment the years between them, his 8 decades of experience and her 4 decades of life, collapsed into simple mutual respect. But the story was not over. Crockett straightened and said, "Judge Posner, earlier you said politicians like me don't understand how federal courts function. Let's talk about that." She lifted another stack of papers, motions, orders, judgments, each stamped with authentic federal seals. "These are real filings. Real hearings. Real victories. And all of them were achieved while serving full-time in Congress." The audience erupted again, not in applause yet, but in a collective hum of realization. The so-called politician had just proven herself more active in the law than many who called themselves full-time attorneys. And that's when it happened, a subtle but powerful shift. Judge Posner took off his glasses once more, not to clean them this time, but to rub his eyes. When he looked up, something had changed. The arrogance that once filled his posture was gone. What replaced it was curiosity, maybe even admiration. Crockett's voice softened. "Judge, this isn't about me winning an argument. It's about reminding everyone in this room what real legal service looks like. It's about remembering that law is not a title, it's a responsibility." She closed the folder, the sound echoing like a final gavel strike. The hall stayed utterly silent. Judge Posner opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He simply sat there, a man known for destroying weak reasoning, now facing evidence so strong that even he could find no flaw. Outside, through the tall windows, the late afternoon sun had turned the campus gold. Inside, every person knew they had just witnessed a transformation, not of power, but of respect. Then, at last, the judge leaned forward to his microphone. His voice came low, almost hesitant. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, "I owe you an apology." Gasps filled the room. For decades, law students had read stories of Posner's unshakable certainty. But never, not once, had they seen him admit fault. The congresswoman smiled softly. "Apology accepted," she said, "but there's more to learn from this moment than just forgiveness." She took a small step closer, meeting his eyes again. "Because what happened here today isn't only between you and me. It's about how our profession decides who belongs and who doesn't." Her words settled over the room like a blanket. People didn't move. They didn't even blink. And just when everyone thought the confrontation was over, she placed one final document on the podium, something entirely different from the rest. It wasn't a brief. It wasn't a motion. It was a draft of legislation. The title at the top read, "The Federal Court Efficiency Act." She looked straight at the judge. "This," she said quietly, "was written in your honor." The crowd gasped again. Posner's eyes widened. He reached instinctively for his glasses and leaned closer, studying the title page. Before he could ask a question, Crockett added, "Part 2 of our story doesn't end with apology. It begins with understanding." And as she turned the first page, the audience leaned forward once more, unaware that what they were about to hear would challenge everything they believed about justice, humility, and change. The sound of the paper turning was soft, but in that still room it felt like thunder. Everyone waited for the next word. Crockett took a slow breath and began to read, her voice steady, gentle, and clear. "This bill," she said, "the Federal Court Efficiency Act, was written to fix something we both care about, how justice is delayed not because of bad judges or bad lawyers, but because of broken systems." Her eyes lifted toward Posner. "You wrote about this 20 years ago, Judge, when you said our courts were drowning in procedure instead of swimming in reason. You were right then, and you're right now." Every sentence she spoke seemed to carry both respect and quiet defiance. "This bill doesn't attack the courts," she continued. "It strengthens them. It takes your theories, the ones about data-driven resource allocation, alternative dispute programs, and simplified discovery, and turns them into action." Her hand moved gently across the page. Section 1 proposes funding for core technology upgrades so filings can move in hours instead of weeks. Section 2 creates a public database to track case backlogs in real time. Section 3 allows judges to reassign lower priority civil cases when criminal dockets overflow. And Section 4, my favorite, introduces early mediation panels staffed by retired attorneys volunteering their time. Murmurs swept through the audience again. These weren't political talking points. They were practical solutions written in plain legal English. Posner adjusted his microphone, but said nothing. He simply watched her, his expression a mix of disbelief and respect. Crockett went on, her words flowing like a slow river that carried everyone along. "Judge, you once said law without empathy becomes arithmetic. I kept that quote on my office wall. This bill was designed around that belief, that empathy can live beside efficiency." She paused, and the hall grew even quieter. "For too long, we've treated justice like a factory, more cases in, more judgments out. But behind every docket number there's a person. A mother fighting for custody. A worker defending a paycheck. A veteran trying to keep his home. Efficiency matters, but humanity matters more." At that, something inside Posner softened. The hard lines around his mouth eased. He leaned back, hands folded on the table. It was the look of a man who had spent a lifetime teaching, now finding himself being taught. Crockett turned another page. "This proposal," she said, "was reviewed by bipartisan counsel before submission. Both sides agreed on one thing, that justice delayed is justice denied. For once, politics didn't divide us. The law united us." She closed the folder halfway, resting her palms on its cover. "Judge Posner, I didn't come here to prove you wrong. I came here to remind us all that intellect without humility loses its power. The law isn't owned by the old or the young, by the judge or the legislator. It belongs to everyone willing to fight for fairness." The room held its breath. Older professors blinked away emotion. Law students who had entered the hall idolizing Posner now looked at Crockett with awe. Even the cameras seemed quieter, as though afraid the click of a shutter might break the spell. Posner finally spoke, his voice rough but sincere. "Congresswoman, I criticized you because I thought the courtroom defined the lawyer. But I see now that the lawyer defines the courtroom." He hesitated, choosing each word carefully. "You've built bridges where I only built arguments." Crockett smiled faintly. "That's kind of you to say, Judge. But the truth is, you built the foundation I'm standing on." There was a long pause. Then, unexpectedly, the audience began to clap. At first softly, then louder, until the applause filled every corner of the room. Crockett tried to wave them down, but they wouldn't stop. For that one rare moment, politicians, professors, and jurists all stood together, applauding not sides but substance. When the sound finally died away, Crockett looked out at the sea of faces. She could see tears in the eyes of a few older lawyers, and quiet pride in the younger ones. She took one last look at Judge Posner and said, "Maybe this is what progress looks like, not winning over each other, but learning from each other." The judge nodded slowly. "Maybe it is." She gathered her papers, but before leaving the podium, she looked back at the audience. "Tonight," she said softly, "you saw a debate, but what I hope you remember is the dialogue. Because the law, at its best, is a conversation, not a verdict." That line would later appear in headlines across the country. The law is a conversation, not a verdict. Outside, the evening had turned cool. Reporters rushed to file their stories. Students lingered, still whispering. Judge Posner remained seated, staring down at the legislation she had handed him. His fingers traced the margins where she had written small notes in pencil. He smiled to himself, a rare, gentle smile that those who knew him had almost never seen. He finally looked up, but she was gone, already surrounded by well-wishers near the exit. He raised his voice just enough to be heard. "Congresswoman Crockett." She turned, halfway through the crowd. "Yes, Judge." He held up the document. "Would you allow me to co-sponsor this idea? Not as a politician, but as a student of the law." Gasps again. The same man who once called her a fake lawyer was now offering to stand beside her. Crockett walked back toward him, the crowd parting around her. She reached out her hand. "Only if you'll let me quote you in the preamble." He chuckled. "Which quote?" She smiled. "The one about humility being the highest form of intellect." He laughed softly. "I said that?" "You did," she said. "Maybe not in print, but you lived it tonight." The audience erupted again, but this time it wasn't applause, it was laughter, the kind that heals tension and turns strangers into allies. As the event drew to a close, news crews surrounded them. Microphones appeared, flashing lights filled the room, and reporters shouted questions about politics, justice, and forgiveness. Crockett answered each one with patience. Posner mostly stayed silent, letting her words speak for both of them. Later that night, a clip from the conference would go viral. It would show the exact moment when the judge extended his hand and said, "I was wrong." Millions would watch it. Some would cry. Some would cheer. And thousands of young lawyers would write in their journals that this was the day they decided to practice law differently, with heart as well as logic. But inside that hall, as the crowd thinned and the lights dimmed, one truth lingered quietly: change had finally entered the old walls of legal tradition. Judge Posner stood near the podium long after everyone had gone. The janitor switched off rows of lights, leaving him in a cone of dim gold from the last chandelier. He looked down at the stack of papers again. The same folder that had once been a weapon now felt like a gift. He whispered to himself, "She proved it, law is alive." Outside, Jasmine Crockett stepped into the cool night. The wind from Lake Michigan brushed her face. She closed her eyes, listening to the distant hum of the city, cars, voices, life. For a moment, she smiled not for victory, but for peace. Because tonight had not been about triumph, it had been about truth. And yet, deep inside her, she knew this was only the beginning. A single debate had opened a national conversation. Journalists were already framing it as a turning point. Her phone buzzed non-stop, messages from law students, judges, and even political rivals thanking her for restoring faith in the legal profession. She looked at the glowing screen, then slipped the phone back into her pocket. The fight ahead would be harder, getting the bill through committees, winning votes, keeping the message pure, but she was ready. Because she now understood that sometimes, the greatest way to win respect is to stand quietly and let your work speak. As she walked toward her car, a reporter called out from behind, "Congresswoman Crockett, one question. Do you think Judge Posner will actually support your bill?" She turned, smiling beneath the streetlight. "I think tonight he supported something bigger than a bill," she said. "He supported growth. And growth, in any form, is the beginning of justice." The reporter lowered his camera, nodding slowly. In that small exchange, something universal was said, something that older viewers across America would later replay and feel deep in their hearts: that redemption isn't loud, and respect isn't demanded, it's earned, one truth at a time. Crockett opened her car door, the city lights reflecting in the window. She took one last look at the old law school behind her. Then she whispered, "Round 2 begins tomorrow." The camera faded on her silhouette against the city skyline, a reminder that some victories happen in silence, but their echoes last forever. "Round 2 begins tomorrow." Those words echoed in her mind long after she said them. The next morning, Washington woke under a gray sky that felt heavy with rain and expectation. News channels replayed the Chicago confrontation in endless loops. Headlines screamed across every screen: Congresswoman Crockett humbles legendary judge. Some commentators called it courage. Others called it political theater. But everyone agreed on one thing: Jasmine Crockett had become the most talked about name in American law and politics overnight. Inside her Capitol Hill office, the lights burned before dawn. Coffee cups, folders, and drafts of the Federal Court Efficiency Act covered the table. Her team of aides looked exhausted yet electric with purpose. "We have 72 hours before the first committee review," said her chief counsel, Aaron Mills, rubbing his temples. "Opposition's already forming. They're saying your bill weakens judicial independence." Crockett leaned against the desk, calm but alert. "It doesn't weaken it," she said. "It modernizes it. But we'll have to prove that in plain language, not legal jargon." She looked out the window at the Capitol dome glowing pale in the mist. "Let's make sure they understand the heart of it: justice delayed is justice denied." That afternoon, the storm truly began. Cable hosts debated her motives. Anonymous sources whispered that Judge Posner's sudden praise had been staged. Old rivals from her district appeared on talk shows questioning her real loyalty to Congress or to the courtroom. By nightfall, hashtags flooded social media: #FakeBill, #CrockettShow, #Judge-turned-actor. Yet among the noise were voices of gratitude: young lawyers, overworked public defenders, law students inspired by her calm defiance. "You made me believe again," one message read. She saved it to her phone without replying. The next day, the Judiciary Committee room buzzed like a beehive. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters whispered, waiting for sparks. Crockett sat at the center of the long wooden table, the thick draft of her bill before her. When the chairman called her name, she stood, hands folded. "Mr. Chairman, members of the committee," she began, her tone slow, steady, deliberate. "I submit this bill not as a politician seeking headlines, but as a lawyer seeking efficiency. Every broken system we ignore is a person's life delayed." A skeptical senator interrupted. "Congresswoman, isn't it true this proposal was co-written by a retired judge with strong opinions on limiting litigation?" "Yes," she said simply. "Judge Richard Posner. He inspired it. His scholarship reminded me that justice without speed is justice denied." Gasps and murmurs spread through the room. Cameras clicked wildly. Somewhere far away, in a small Chicago office filled with law books, the old judge watched the hearing on a flickering screen. He smiled faintly and whispered, "She's doing it." As the hearing continued, opposition intensified. Lobbyists circulated memos warning that automation and efficiency would cost clerical jobs. A powerful senator from another state accused her of hollow populism. Crockett didn't flinch. "Efficiency doesn't mean fewer people," she said. "It means fewer wasted hours. It gives judges more time for real justice, not paperwork." By midday the debate turned personal. One senator sneered, "Maybe the Congresswoman should spend less time lecturing and more time governing." A few chuckles rippled. Crockett waited for silence, then said softly, "Senator, governing is lecturing our own conscience about what we owe the people." The room went silent again. Even the reporters paused their typing. When the hearing ended, she stepped outside into a wall of flashing cameras. Rain had begun to fall, turning the marble steps slick and shining. "Congresswoman, do you think the bill will survive committee?" a reporter shouted. She stopped, rain dripping from her hair, and answered quietly, "Justice has survived worse." Then she walked on, her heels echoing against the wet stone. The rain outside the Capitol had stopped, but the air still carried that quiet tension that follows a storm, and as Jasmine Crockett walked through the marble corridors with her coat folded over one arm, she felt the weight of every headline, every whisper, every doubt that had shadowed her journey, yet deep inside she carried only calm determination, because this day, the day of the final vote, was not about politics or pride. It was about proving that truth, once spoken with conviction, could move even the oldest walls of power. Inside the chamber the seats were filled, the cameras hummed, the air thick with anticipation as clerks passed out the final printed copies of the Federal Court Efficiency Act. She sat quietly, her hands folded, her mind replaying the long path from that first confrontation in Chicago to this trembling moment of decision. When her name was called to speak, she rose slowly, looking around at faces that were once hostile but now curious, softened, human. "My father used to tell me," she began softly, "that a slow clock still tells the right time twice a day. Our courts have been that slow clock, right in principle, delayed in practice, and this bill is about winding it again." A low murmur spread through the room, even the cynics listened. Somewhere high in the gallery, Judge Richard Posner sat with a blanket across his knees, watching silently. His eyes followed every movement, proud, reflective, aware that he was witnessing not the death of his era but its renewal. One by one, the votes began. The green lights and red lights flashed across the electronic board, and the sound of the clerk's voice echoed like a metronome of history: aye. Nay. Aye, until at last the numbers froze. There was a pause that seemed to last an eternity, and then the announcement came: the Federal Court Efficiency Act is hereby passed. For a moment there was only silence, the kind that comes before realization, and then the chamber erupted into applause. Crockett closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, not as victory but as relief. She looked up to the gallery, and there he was, Posner, clapping softly, a faint smile cutting through the lines of age. Later that evening, as twilight settled over the city, they met again in the quiet rotunda beneath the Capitol dome. "You did it," he said. "No," she replied gently, "we did." He handed her a small envelope, the edges slightly trembling in his hand. Inside was a short note written in his tidy, old-fashioned script, "for reminding me that the law still has a heartbeat. R.P." She smiled, tears welling despite herself, and said, "Judge, I'll keep this with my bar card." They laughed softly, and for a while they just stood there, two silhouettes framed by the glow of history. Outside, the bells of the city began to ring for the evening hour, echoing through the streets like a hymn to renewal. The next morning, newspapers across America printed a single headline: "From clash to collaboration, the day law remembered its heart." In homes and diners and offices, people watched the replay: how a congresswoman once called a fake lawyer turned the greatest skeptic into her ally, how humility conquered pride, how respect replaced ridicule. And far from the cameras, in a small Chicago apartment lined with legal books, the old judge sat at his desk, signed one last letter to a former student, and whispered to the empty room, "The law is safe now." Meanwhile, on the Capitol steps, Jasmine Crockett looked out at the sunrise breaking through the clouds, the city waking beneath her, and thought of every young woman, every young lawyer who might one day stand where she stood, holding her own folder of proof, her own courage against doubt. She whispered to the wind, "Never let them tell you who you are, show them." Then she turned to the camera crews waiting nearby, smiled with that quiet strength that had become her trademark, and said, "This is not the end of a debate, it's the beginning of a new standard." She lifted her hand toward the lens, her voice steady and kind: "If you believe that truth still matters, if you believe that one person can still make justice move, don't forget to like this story, share it, and subscribe, because this journey may be over, but the next fight for fairness begins right here, with you." The screen faded slowly to black, the soft sound of rain returning under the closing music, and a final line appeared in simple white letters: "Integrity is louder than arrogance, and sometimes the quietest voice in the room changes everything."